Please note, in this episode we will be discussing themes of poverty and crime, which some listeners may find upsetting.
When I grew up, I was told you wouldn't walk down China Lane at night, and I thought there has to be two sides to the story of China Lane.
Welcome to 100 Years, 100 Objects, stories from the collections of Lancaster City Museums. My name is Rachel Roberts, Collections Registrar at Lancaster City Museums. 2023 marks 100 years of our museums and collections, and we're celebrating by examining 100 intriguing objects that help tell the story of Lancaster, Morecambe and the surrounding area. We're venturing into one of the most notorious streets in Lancaster's history to find out more about the real lives that played out there. Today's object is a photograph of China Lane. The copy of the photograph that we have in the collection has been produced as a postcard, although nothing has been written on the back. That means it's the same size as most of the Victorian and Edwardian photographs in our collection, around 12 cm by 8 cm. The scene shows a view down China Lane, which used to be where China Street, part of the A6, can now be found. The lane is just wide enough for the cart that can be seen in the background to get down it. The buildings either side are 2 or 3 stories high and are dotted with streetlights and shop signs advertising lodging houses and pubs. Some of the residents have gathered to pose for the photograph on either side of the street, and the small crowd consists of men, women and children, mainly dressed in modest clothes, looking straight at the camera. Because of the layout of the back of the postcard, we can say that the postcard itself was probably produced between 1902 and 1918. However, the photograph is clearly older. We can't be sure exactly when it was taken, but from the business signs that can be seen, it's probably sometime in the 1890s. China Lane had a rather infamous reputation, being known as one of the less salubrious areas of town, and frequently written about negatively in local newspapers. But it was also a place where real people lived often quite hard lives. We spoke to Philip Martin, museum assistant at Lancaster City Museum, and local historian who can be found on several social media platforms under the name HistoryGeek26, to find out more about the people of China Lane.
It's about a minute from the city centre, so the market square we've got today, being the main road through Lancaster, which would have gone to the old bridge across the River Lune. It is quite ancient, really. It is a relatively important street in Lancaster. Even today, with it being the main road, it's still one of those most important streets in Lancaster. Back in the 18th century and even the 19th century, we do know that it was a lot smaller there. It's been called a few names through the years. We've got Chinnell Lane to Channel Lane, channel coming from the Danish word keln, by the Saxons, you see. We've also got records of Cheney Lane, Chiney Lane, and even Cherry Lane in the 18th century. I've kind of nicknamed that area Lancaster's Miniature Whitechapel. That kind of name fit the context of what was going on there, living conditions. We know of China Street in Lancaster today, the long queues of traffic, the lights changing quicker than the gloom of this city's weather. But you'll notice a glimpse of Lancaster's past still standing through the present, and you'd be quite right in thinking these buildings tell a tale or two long after their neighbours have since been forced into Lancaster's history. They could tell you that this street, or so it was lane, was once the centre of the poor during the 19th century. It was crammed with brothels, inns and lodging houses, and with a touch of similarity between London's Whitechapel of the 1880s, although massively smaller. The area was overcrowded, and with endless stories of crime, the working, the living and the sanitation conditions for those who lived in the area were horrendous. China Lane, a lane so narrow it was once said in 1891, a couple of two-wheeled vehicles of modern description could not pass each other if meeting in the lane. Other accounts recall stagecoaches travelling through the narrow lane, at times leaving scratches amongst the buildings, with the horns of the stagecoaches resounding from the walls to walls as they passed through on their trips through the once main highway of Lancaster. By accounts, this lane was no more than 8 feet 6 inches wide, an unbelievably small entrance through the city by today's standards.
So what sort of things were going on China Lane in the 18th and 19th centuries? Was this a place of homes, one of business and industry, or a mixture?
First of all, I will mention that there were 7 inns down there during the first part of the 19th century. So we had places like the Bay Horse, the Coach and Horses, Hole in the Wall, the Golden Fleece, the Bull, which was later the Spink Bull, the 3 Tons, the Dog and Partridge, and that later then became the Volunteer. But the certain kind of industries we know that was down there include the likes of cabinet makers down there. We've got liquor merchants, clockmakers, tailors. We do have brothels down there, lodging houses. We do have accounts of 1-bedroom apartments, a lot of people living together. Also with these lodging houses, what I have done is mapped out 2 maps of China Lane, one being the latter stages of that lane and one being the first stages of the 19th century, and indicated each individual, other than the lodgers, of accounts of everybody living there. And there is quite a number of people living there.
Let's get to the darker side of China Lane's history. People who've looked into Lancaster's past might know that this area of town had a reputation for crime and unsanitary conditions, and became the prime example used when newspapers and speakers spoke of why changes were needed in the town. We asked Phil if the rumours were true.
There is a notorious side of history about China Lane, and yes, there was a lot of goings on there, which we will get to. But that's not to mention that that was the only place in Lancaster, because if you do look back into certain aspects and the newspaper archives, for instance, of Lancaster, you'll notice that during the 19th century, Lancaster's declined financially, basically. So there is these certain areas of Lancaster which are pretty much similar to China Lane, but China Lane seems to have this description about it like no other place in Lancaster. What I'm trying to do is indicate that these people aren't as bad as they seem, and these people have pretty much got a bad rep. I was looking at the family called the Fian family. I've actually been speaking to ancestors of the Fian family who had told me quite a few stories about them. They seem quite notorious in China Lane. There is a lot of crimes that they are doing. Petty theft, drunken disorderly, assaults in Lancaster. And we've also got other stories, including a lot of women in China Lane that would end up in those 7 inns. Most notorious inn for a lot of things happening was actually the Volunteer, which was towards the east side and right at the end connecting onto Church Street. That seems to be a location where there was a lot of activity by women, possibly getting too drunk and then causing quite a scene down there. But on the other side of that, there is a lot of depression, anxiety, mental health down there, which in the newspapers, again, they're crediting as being quite a negative scene. But I always look at it whereas if they haven't anything to look forward to, and certainly times are hard in Lancaster at that time, and especially when you're picking up a newspaper and reading what the Lancaster Gazette was saying about the area you're living in, it's pretty hard to pull yourself out of that and be quite positive about life. Hopefully I'll be able to put forward a positive outlook on China Lane, and maybe one day Lancastrians might look at China Lane with more sympathy, because I know when I grew up, I was told by my mother, who did walks and talks of Lancaster, you wouldn't walk down China Lane at night. And I thought, I'm going to have to look into that and see, first of all, if that's true, and second of all, there has to be 2 sides to the story of China Lane.
We've mentioned that local papers were rarely kind to China Lane and its residents, and so Phil told us a little bit more about how they portrayed this street.
The Lancaster Gazette in the 19th century would label China Lane as the scum of Lancaster, and that is to quote exactly what they said, the scum of Lancaster, which I think's an unfair description of China Lane, because in the 19th century Lancaster does have these certain areas, just like China Lane. So I think they get quite a hard description there. And I know certainly to the end of the 19th century, so around 1894, when they decided to demolish the west side of China Lane, the Lancaster Gazette actually put out a newspaper article on China Lane, and I'm going to read it out to quote exactly what they said. Then there is the point to be considered, what is to become of the population of China Lane. The class of people who reside there will not be eradicated by the demolition of the present buildings. They will go elsewhere and contaminate other parts of this town, which again is a very unfair description of these families. You know, you have a lot of families in China Lane that can't make ends meet. They're trying their best. We even have an inventor in China Lane back in the 19th century. Mr. Charles Kirby. He lived at the Oven House Gate in China Lane, which Lancaster City Museum have some fantastic photographs of the Oven House. And in 1818, he invented a machinery for cleaning chimneys and preventing the use of sweeping boys. And so you can't really give China Lane such a 100% negative outlook when you have people like that working and living there and trying their best.
However, there's no denying that many of the people who lived on China Lane were some of the poorest residents of Lancaster and were facing extremely difficult circumstances with no one to help them and little chance of improving their lives. This led to a number of very sad personal stories. Phil told us about one of them.
This is about a lady called Sarah Parker. This woman had a 12-year-old daughter, and they lived on the east side of China Lane, about halfway in. And her daughter came running down the stairs, indicating to her mother that she'd seen the mythical creatures boggarts in her bedroom. Sarah decided to take a kitchen knife and go upstairs, indicating that she had slashed this boggart to get it out of the room, but what she hadn't realised is she was slashing her daughter, and she sliced her throat and her body. Now, thankfully, the daughter did survive, but it kind of shows you the mental illness side of China Lane. Now, sadly, Sarah Parker did get transferred to Lancaster Castle before then being transferred to the Moor Hospital. And I kind of feel sorry for these people, that there's nobody giving these people help in the 19th century. Now, I know that this was happening all over the UK. It was a very hard time, but certainly China Lane does get this bad press about it. Sarah Parker, before any of this happened, was quite a positive lady. She had a really good job, with the father of the 12-year-old leaving when there was a baby. There's nobody there to help her in that time period. So you've got to really sympathise with these people as well.
Eventually, most of China Lane was demolished, starting with one side, to allow it to be widened into the new China Street. While many people in Lancaster were in favour of this change, there were some that weren't. Phil shared a poem with us, which was written by John Briggs about these changes. In the poem, the narrator sees a ghost of a former resident and hears him lamenting the buildings that have been demolished. The ghost says, "Where must my ghostly shadow hide? The old home now has vanished. Some other structure, slim and weak, the Goths who live in these dark days rebel against their fathers' ways, sneer at our good old houses, and yet the dens they erect, not build to stand, though gaily decked, my angry passions rouse. Our streets too narrow are by half to satisfy the modern calf. He cannot air his graces, and so he pulls good houses down that were once valued in this town, to put worse in their place. For long I dwelt contented here, with my sweet wife and children dear, who well and truly loved me. This street is doomed to perish, and I must seek another place, far from the home that housed my race. The home I fondly cherished, it is the council's aim to sweep away its very name, and in commemoration of their deed, what vanity, I'm told we very soon shall see, a street called Corporation." So how did China Lane meet its end?
It was about the 1820s into the 1830s when they actually started planning a demolition of China Lane. So that's relatively early, before a lot of these stories were going on. So I think it's something that they've always wanted to do. And did finally. And there is actually one building remaining on China Street today, which goes back to the 18th century. And that is 3 businesses now, right next to the pub. They were originally built as houses. Now, I looked into the buildings, and they was built for captains of Lancaster. China Lane was potentially going to be a good area. But I'm guessing because of the decline of the port, then the banks crashing, everything just halted. And they just basically didn't spend any money on China Lane. There was a lot of buildings there from the 17th century, and I'm looking into the newspapers, they were planning on demolishing certain parts of those buildings and upgrading it, but again, because of the financial crisis in Lancaster, they just left it to rot. To quote from the Lancaster Gazette of the late 19th century, "We can only look to the future to sweep away the slums, the dirty, narrow, unhealthy and insanitary slums. What will cost £13,000 to do this? Can only be looked at as a positive. The once respectable China Lane, which became the home of the deprived section of the community and embraced the thief, the bully, the unfortunate, and included the scum of the town. When this dirty, dusty, criminal-haunted China Lane has passed away, and we have in its place a noble street of handsome buildings, can we have a bright future in the town of Lancaster? The west side of China Lane was demolished in 1896. On the east side, some buildings to the northern end were also pulled down as well as the Bay Horse Inn on the southern end, which made way for the Castle Hotel, now called the Pub. And China Lane became China Street on September the 18th, 1899.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of 100 Years, 100 Objects. Why not listen to some of our other episodes where we examine objects from stone axes to shipbuilders' stencils?